You're lying in bed, half asleep, and out of nowhere your brain plays you a clip. Something you said in a group chat 4 years ago. A voicemail you left. The way you signed an email warmly to someone you barely knew. Your whole body reacts before your mind even catches up, jaw tight, shoulders curling in. A sound escapes you that isn't quite a groan. You didn't choose to remember this. It chose you. And somehow the memory of a text message from 2019 has more power over your nervous system right now than most things happening today. Why does this happen? Why does a version of you that no longer exists, a person you've outgrown, outthought, outdressed, still have the ability to make your current body flinch? You'd think time would soften it. It doesn't. If anything, the cringe gets sharper the further away you get from the moment. Most people explain this to themselves as proof that they were an idiot. Proof they were awkward, needy, embarrassing, too much. They treat the cringe as a verdict on who they were, and quietly as evidence about who they still might be underneath the improvements. That explanation is wrong. Not comforting wrong. Social psychologist Michael Ross spent years studying how people evaluate their past selves, and his research found something almost nobody expects. The discomfort you feel isn't your brain punishing you for having been foolish. It's your brain actively working to prove that you've changed. In this video, we're going to walk through why the cringe exists, what it's actually built to do, and why the people who feel it most intensely are often the ones who've grown the most, not the least. We'll look at where this reaction lives in memory, why it hits certain ages and certain kinds of moments harder than others, and what happens to people who never feel it at all. By the end, you'll understand why that flinch in bed at midnight isn't a flaw in your character. It's a receipt. Here's something strange that happens to memory that almost nobody notices until it's pointed out. When you remember something recent, what you ate for breakfast, a conversation from yesterday, you tend to remember it from the inside. You're behind your own eyes. You see the room the way you actually saw it, in first person, the way a body experiences a moment as it's happening. But older memories work differently. The awkward toast you gave at your cousin's wedding 6 years ago? You don't remember it from behind your own eyes anymore. You remember it from across the room. You can see yourself standing there, glass in hand, saying the thing. You've become a character in your own footage. Researchers call this an observer memory. And the shift from first person to third person isn't random. It happens more the further you get from an event, and it happens especially fast around memories that involve embarrassment. Think about what that actually means. Your brain isn't just storing what happened. It's refilming it. And it's choosing, deliberately, to move the camera outside of you. Why would it do that? Imagine two people remembering the exact same cringeworthy moment, say, an overly confident work presentation that fell flat. One of them replays it from inside their own body, hearing their own voice crack in real time, feeling the room's silence pressing on their chest exactly as it did then. The other replays it like a bystander, watching a person at a podium from a few rows back. Same event. Completely different emotional weight. The first version keeps the wound open. The second version turns the person into a character you can study, judge, and separate yourself from. That second option, becoming a spectator to your own history, is what your brain does automatically, and it does it more aggressively with memories that threaten your sense of who you are now. You may recognize this if you've ever tried to describe an old embarrassing memory to a friend and caught yourself saying, "I don't even know why I did that," as though the person who did it were someone else wearing your face. Ross's research suggests this isn't an accident of forgetting. It's a strategy. The mind is not a neutral archive quietly filing away what happened. It is constantly, invisibly editing the footage, to protect the story you're currently telling about who you are. And that editing job gets a lot more interesting once you understand what the story is actually for. There's a reason this matters more than it sounds like it should. The angle a memory is filmed from changes what you can feel about it. From inside your own body, you have access to the reasons, the nervousness underneath the joke that landed wrong, the loneliness underneath the message you sent 3 times in a row. From outside, watching yourself as a character, you lose the reasons and keep only the behavior. That's why old memories can feel more damning than they were when they were happening. You've literally lost the internal footage that used to explain you to yourself and kept only the external footage that makes you look worse. This is where Michael Ross's central idea comes in, and it's the piece that reframes everything. Ross called it temporal self-appraisal, the theory that people are motivated, often without knowing it, to see their present self as better than their past self. Not accurate. Better, the mind isn't a court reporter transcribing your history in neutral language. It's more like a lawyer building a case for the defense. And the client is the person you are right now. People are highly motivated to see improvement in themselves over time, Ross wrote, even when the objective evidence for that improvement is thin. Read that twice. Even when the evidence is thin. Your brain doesn't need proof that you've grown. It needs a narrative of growth, and it will bend old memories to manufacture one if it has to. Here's the mechanism. To feel like you're improving, your brain needs a before that looks worse than your after. So when you recall a version of yourself from years ago, your mind doesn't just remember them, it quietly downgrades them. It exaggerates their flaws slightly. It removes context that would make their choices look reasonable. It strips out the reasons you did the awkward thing and leaves only the awkwardness. This isn't lying to you. Exactly. It's editing you in the direction that keeps your self-esteem stable in the present. Picture a woman looking back at photos from her early 20s, an outfit she thought was daring at the time, a caption she wrote that was trying too hard to sound clever. In the moment, at 22, she felt confident. Good, even. 10 years later, remembering it, the confidence has been quietly stripped out of the memory and replaced with cringe. Not because the outfit changed, because her brain needed a before that made her current self look like an upgrade. Ross put it plainly in his work on this: the self is not simply remembered, it is reconstructed, and it is reconstructed in the service of the present. That word, reconstructed, is doing a lot of work. It means the past self you're cringing at was never a fixed, objective recording in the first place. It's already an edited draft, revised by whoever you needed to be today. This is why the cringe often gets worse with time instead of better. The further away an old self gets, the more useful it becomes as a contrast, and the more your mind is willing to flatten it into something slightly more foolish than it actually was, just to keep the story of your improvement intact. You may recognize this pattern the next time you cringe at something and then catch yourself thinking, "But I actually thought that was a good idea at the time." That gap between how confident you felt then and how foolish you feel now remembering it isn't a discovery. It's a manufactured contrast, built by a mind that needs you to be climbing, not standing still. This reframes the entire experience. The flinch you feel isn't a punishment being handed down by some internal judge. It's the emotional signature of a system working exactly as designed, constantly comparing versions of you and constantly needing the newest version to win. If temporal self-appraisal is the mechanism, it still leaves a question. Why does the cringe cluster so heavily around certain periods of your life and barely touch others? Most people, if they're honest, find that the overwhelming majority of their worst cringe memories come from a fairly narrow window somewhere between early adolescence and their mid-20s. Not childhood. Not last year. That specific stretch in between, when you were figuring out, in public, who you were allowed to be. There's a reason that window produces the sharpest material. It's the period when your sense of identity is least settled and most publicly tested. New social groups, first romantic attempts, the first years of trying on a personality in front of people who weren't obligated to love you unconditionally the way family is. Every awkward text, every try-hard joke, every overly intense declaration happened while you were actively constructing the self you'd carry forward. That makes those memories unusually rich material for the contrast your brain is looking for, because the before version from that era is genuinely, dramatically different from who you are now. The bigger the actual gap, the more useful the memory is as proof of improvement, so your mind keeps that footage close at hand and replays it more than memories from periods where you changed less. Consider two memories from the same person. Something clumsy you did at 19 and something clumsy you did last Tuesday. Even if the one from last Tuesday was objectively more embarrassing, the one from 19 usually carries more heat. Because it's doing more work. It's not just an embarrassing moment, it's a stand-in for an entire earlier identity your current self needs to feel superior to. Last Tuesday hasn't earned that role yet. Give it a few years, and it will start pulling the same weight. This is also why cringe about your past self often intensifies right after a major life change, a breakup, a move, a career shift, becoming a parent. Anything that sharpens the line between who I was and who I am now gives the mechanism fresh material to work with. You may notice this the next time a big transition hits. Old memories you'd forgotten about suddenly resurface, uninvited. Precisely when your brain has the most motivation to prove that the person on the other side of the transition is someone new. None of this means those years were shameful. It means they were formative, and formative periods generate the sharpest contrast, and contrast is exactly what the mechanism runs on. The years that embarrass you the most in hindsight are very often the years that did the most to build the person currently doing the cringing. Not everyone processes this the same way, and the differences are revealing. Consider two people who both did something embarrassing in their early 20s, say an overzealous, over-the-top public declaration of love that didn't go the way they hoped. The first person, years later, cannot think about it without their whole face going hot. They change the subject when it comes up. They've built an entire internal narrative where that moment defines something shameful and permanent about their character, not something they did, but something they are. For this person, the cringe hasn't faded with distance. It's calcified. The observer memory mechanism that's supposed to create protective distance has instead created a permanent exhibit, one they visit against their will, on a loop, for the rest of their life. The second person barely remembers it happened. When reminded, they laugh, shrug, say something like, "God, I was a mess back then," and move on within seconds. No flinch. No heat. Just mild, distant amusement, the way you describe a stranger's bad decision. Both people changed. Both people grew out of who they were. But only one of them is still emotionally handcuffed to the old version. The difference isn't how embarrassing the moment objectively was, it's how much unfinished business the person still has with who they used to be. Cringe that lingers for decades usually isn't about the event. It's about an identity that hasn't fully closed the file, some part of the old self, or the fear of still being that person, still active underneath the current one. This is worth sitting with, because most people assume the size of the cringe reflects the size of the mistake. It doesn't. It reflects the size of the gap between who you were terrified of being seen as and who you're now trying to prove you've become. Small, forgettable moments can trigger enormous reactions if they touch a nerve about identity being seen as desperate, unintelligent, unlovable. embarrassing in front of people whose opinion mattered enormously at the time. Meanwhile, objectively much worse moments can be recalled with total indifference if they don't threaten anything about who you currently believe yourself to be. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Here's the reframe that changes how this whole experience feels, and it's worth taking seriously rather than rushing past. The intensity of your cringe is not proof that you were pathetic. It's proof that the person feeling it has moved far enough away from who they used to be that the old self now reads as foreign. You cannot cringe at a version of yourself you still fully are. The distance is the whole mechanism. Discomfort requires contrast, and contrast requires growth. Think about the people who never cringe at anything from their past, not because they've made peace with it, but because they haven't actually moved. If your values, behavior, and self-concept are nearly identical to who you were a decade ago, there's no gap for the observer memory system to exploit. Nothing about old you threatens current you, because old you and current you are basically the same file. The absence of cringe, in that case, isn't evidence of health. It can be evidence of stagnation. This is the part almost nobody tells you. Cringe is not a defect in your emotional processing. It is a byproduct of a mind that is actively, constantly trying to prove to itself that it is not standing still. What feels like shame is closer to a survival strategy, an adaptation, not a flaw. Built by a system whose entire job is to keep your sense of self moving in a direction that feels like progress. You didn't develop this pattern because something is wrong with you. You developed it because somewhere along the way, being able to say I've changed mattered to your survival socially, professionally, emotionally, and your brain built a mechanism to keep proving it, over and over, using the only raw material available, the person you used to be. That reframing matters because it changes what you do with the feeling. If cringe is a verdict, you flinch and hide and try to forget. If cringe is a receipt evidence of distance traveled, you can actually look at it. You can ask what, specifically, changed. What you know now that you didn't then. What you'd tell that version of yourself if you could, not to shame them, but to update them. There's a subtler cost to getting this wrong, too. People who interpret their cringe as proof of permanent inadequacy often start avoiding anything that risks future embarrassment, new hobbies, bold declarations, creative work, dating, public speaking, because the emotional cost of a future cringe memory feels unbearable in advance. They mistake the volume of the feeling for the size of the threat. But the volume was never about the actual event. It was about identity friction. Once you know that, the fear of future embarrassment loses some of its grip, because you understand what's actually generating the heat. So what do you actually do with this the next time it hits you at 1 a.m.? And your whole body seizes around a memory that's been dead for years. The first move is naming the mechanism out loud, even just in your head. Instead of "I can't believe I did that," "I'm so embarrassing," try, "This is temporal self-appraisal. My brain is proving distance, not delivering a verdict." That single reframe interrupts the loop. Because shame needs you to believe the story it's telling. The moment you can see the machinery behind the curtain, the story loses some of its authority over you. The second move is asking a more useful question than "Why was I like that?" Ask instead, what did that version of me actually need, that I know how to give myself now? The 22-year-old who wrote the caption "trying too hard to sound clever" wasn't defective. She was hungry to be noticed, and she didn't yet know that the noticing she wanted couldn't come from a caption. That's not humiliating. That's just what being early in your own life looks like from a distance. Every person you'll ever respect has an old you exactly like this, if they're honest. There's a version of this that shows up at work too, and it's worth naming because people rarely connect the two. The junior version of you who asked an obvious question in a meeting, who oversold an idea that fell flat, who didn't yet know the unwritten rules of the room. That version gets the exact same treatment as your awkward 22-year-old self. The instinct is to cringe and disown. But that junior version is the one who took the swing before you knew better, and every skill you now rely on without thinking was built on top of moments exactly like the ones you're wincing at. Competence has amnesia built into it. It forgets how new the ground under it used to be. The third move, and this is the one people skip, is resisting the urge to fully disown the old self. It's tempting, when the cringe hits, to mentally exile that version of you entirely. That's not me. That person's an idiot. I'm nothing like that anymore. It feels protective. But total disowning tends to backfire, because a self you've completely cut off from can't teach you anything. The goal isn't distance for its own sake, it's integration with distance. You want to be far enough away to see clearly, and close enough to still claim the person as yours. The people who've done the most genuine growing tend to speak about their old selves with something closer to affection than contempt. Embarrassed, sure, but fond. The way you describe a clumsy, well-meaning, younger sibling. You may notice, if you start paying attention, that your most intense cringe clusters around a handful of specific themes being seen as too eager, too naive, too desperate for approval, too unaware of how you were coming across. Those themes are worth writing down, because they're not random. They're pointing directly at the identity you're still, right now, in the present, most afraid of being mistaken for. The cringe is a map. Most people never think to read it that way. There's one more move worth naming, even though it's less about technique and more about posture. It's choosing, on purpose, to update the story you tell about that old version of you out loud, to someone else, not just in your own head. There's a specific kind of relief that comes from telling a friend the exact memory that's been haunting you and hearing them laugh, not at you, but with the easy recognition of someone who has their own version of the same tape. Shame tends to thrive in isolation, where the old self stays frozen exactly as your harshest internal edit left them. Said out loud, in the light, most of these memories shrink immediately, because another person's face doesn't carry the exaggerated verdict your own private replay does. They just see a person who was young, or new at something, or trying too hard because they cared. That's usually all it ever was. And there's a final piece worth carrying with you, one day, and it will happen sooner than you expect. The version of you sitting here right now worrying about a text message, replaying a conversation, cringing at something you said last month will become someone else's old footage. Someone future you will watch from across the room with the exact same flinch, the exact same fondness, the exact same quiet astonishment that they used to be that person. That's not a tragedy. That's the mechanism doing exactly what it's built to do. It means you're still moving. So the next time it happens, the sudden heat in your chest over something that ended years ago, a version of you that no longer walks around in the world, don't reach for shame first. Reach for the fact underneath it. You are not the same person. You can feel the gap because the gap is real. Let the old you stay exactly where they are, a little embarrassing, a little tender, a little brave for not knowing better, and keep walking. Because somewhere ahead of you, another version of yourself is already waiting to look back at who you are right now, and wince, and smile, and understand.